shouldest be a fairly short trial, so let's receive it to finish the present day. Are both sides F to proceed?
F, thy honor.
The defense is F.
'Tis fine. Miss Jones, thee may beginneth thy opening statement.
May it pride the court. Valorous morn. My own name is Hermione Jones, and I represent the plaintiff Thomas Nashe in this case. As thee hath heard from the judge, this is a copyright infringement case. The defendant in this case, William Shakespeare, did steal the intellectual property of Mr. Nashe and other authors, and hath used it to writeth the historical play Henry VI, Part 1. At the conclusion of this case, we shall cometh back and asketh thee for a verdict of guilty. This is not simply a case of incidental inclusion or coincidence. The evidence shall show it. Yond Mr. Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 1, is substantially similar to the worketh and writing style of Mr. Nashe. To such a rise yond it can beast has said, yond the worketh wast did copy or adapted from Mr. Nashe's worketh, rather than simply being a similar idea. Ladies and gentlemen, the defense may argue, yond the defendant didst not copy Mr. Nashe's worketh, but yond Mr. Shakespeare wroteth the playeth, using his own arts and talents as a playwright. However, thee shall heareth from Mr. Nashe, who is it shall state yond, this is not true. Not only shall Mr. Nashe bid thee this is not true, but the evidence shall showeth the striking similarities between Mr. Nashe's original writings and style and Henry VI, Part 1. 'Twill not only showeth the similarities in Mr. Nashe's worketh in Henry VI, Part 1, but 'twill eke showeth just how different Henry VI, Part 1 is from Mr. Shakespeare's other writings. We are going to asketh thee to value this case, and we are going to asketh for a lot of wage, and it is going to beast up to thee to putteth a value, to put out what thou art allowing the verdict to beast in this case. And I am going to suggest to thee, anon yon, after hearing all the evidence at the conclusion of this case, thou art going to see, yon, this is the kind of case yon shall allow for a verdict in the millions. In a copyright infringement case, the burden of proof rests with the plaintiff. The standard of proof in this case is a preponderance of the evidence. Yond is just a plated way of declaring it is more likely than not yond the defendant committed copyright infringement. We believeth yond we shall meeteth this standard, and asketh yond thee returneth a verdict of guilty. Thank thee.
Miss Smith, thee may give it thy opening.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I wanteth to thank thee for being hither the present day, and for thy participation in this case. Mine own name is Portia Smith, and I represent the defendant, William Shakespeare. Mr. Nashe has accused Mr. Shakespeare of intellectual property theft in the form of copyright infringement. We hither the present day to showeth thee yond the accusation is false, and thither is nay evidence to support it. The plaintiff is going to put it on its case first. Then the defendant shall has it the opportunity to put it on his case. All I asketh thee, keepeth an open mind throughout the entire process, and reserve thy judgment until thee hasn't heard all of the evidence. Ultimately, the job shall be beast to sort out all, decideth what had happened. What didn't befall, decideth what's the suit, what's not the suit, and maketh a decision. In charge to prove yon thither wist a copyright infringement, the plaintiff will showeth ownership of a valid copyright and copying of the essential elements of the worketh yond art original. This element requires proof of actual copying of the plaintiff's worketh by the defendant, and yon such copying constitutes an improper appropriation of the worketh. it is important to recall yon the burden of proof is on the plaintiff for the entire trial, not Mr. Shakespeare. We are going to present the case to thee, and we are going to show it thee yon Mr. Shakespeare did not commit copyright infringement. Thee shall hear from Mr. Shakespeare himself, who shall bid thee yon, while he was inspired historical events, and the worketh of those o'er him, something yon every writer does, and shall admit to, he didn't not directly copy any of his worketh. Thee hasn't heard from the plaintiff's counsel yon Mr. Shakespeare is a fraud, and yon he does not is capable of writing plays of such high magnitude. The reason they filleth this way is because Mr. Shakespeare is not a member of the same social class, yon their art. Unlike Mr. Nashe, Mr. Shakespeare is not university educated, nor was he born into an aristocratic family. Because of his upbringing, some members of the association believeth yon he is simply not intelligent or worldly, and now he has to write his plays and poetry. However, this is simply not true. While Mr. Shakespeare was not educated at the likes of Cambridge like Mr. Nashe, he did study historical subjects, literature, and grammar in school, and was able to write masterpieces such as A Winter's Tale, Othello, and King Lear because of his most wondrous imagination, a trait critical to any playwright. Imagination is not something yon thee learneth in school or art born with simply because thee belong to an aristocratic family. An innate ability to imagine the characters and plots yon he endues to life his plays is what maketh Mr. Shakespeare most wondrous, not his upbringing. Ere the trial ends, it hasn't a chance to talk to thee again, and at yon time I'll ask thee to findeth yon my own client, Mr. Shakespeare, not guilty of copyright infringement.
Thy first witness, Miss Jones?
We calleth the plaintiff Thomas Nashe.
Doth thee solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help thee God?
I doth.
Thee may question the witness.
Can thee prithee state thy name for thy record?
Thomas Nashe,
And whither thee wast born, Thomas?
Lowestoft, on the coast of Suffolk.
What doth thee doth for a living?
I'm a playwright, a poet, and a satirist.
Hast thee haddeth any worketh published?
My known most popular work be a play entitled Summer's Last Shall and Testament. I wrote 3 short poems, yon was all drawn from this play, hath called Adieu, Farewell, Earth's Bliss, Fair Summer Drops, and Autumn hath all the summer's fruitful treasure.
Whither didst thee attend school?
I began attending St. John's College, Cambridge, and did get mine own bachelor's.
And what didst thee doeth after yond?
'Twas my mind's own decision to move to London to find work as a playwright.
How doth thee knoweth the defendant, William Shakespeare?
I knoweth William as a fellow playwright in London.
Didst thee ever worketh with Mr. Shakespeare?
Nay.
May I approacheth thy witness?
Aye.
Couldst thee behold at Exhibit 1, prithee?
Aye.
Doth thee recognize yon document?
Aye. 'Tis a copy of my journal, my table. I write my ideas, my drafts in.
The plaintiff moves for admission of Exhibit 1, thy honor.
Nay, objection.
Receive it.
Thomas, can thee turn to page 3 of thy journal and bid us what is hath found on yon page?
'Tis part of a play I was working on about King Henry VI.
Wherefore didst thee decideth to worketh on a playeth about the life of King Henry VI?
I was interested in the life of King Henry VI. King Henry VI, Part 1, deals with the loss of England's French territories, the political conspiracies leading up to the War of the Roses, as the English political system is torn apart by personal fights and jealousies.
Couldst thee behold at Exhibit 2, prithee?
Aye.
Doth thee recognize yon document?
Aye. It's a copy of the play of King Henry VI, Part 1. Yon was published under the name William Shakespeare.
The plaintiff moves for the admission of Exhibit 2, thy honor.
Nay, objection.
Receive it.
Thomas, doth thee believeth yon Mr. Shakespeare wroteth Henry VI, Part 1 on his own?
Nay.
Wherefore is yond?
Because I wrote a substantial partith, and other partiths was writ by other authors. Mr. Shakespeare wrote less than 20% of the play.
Which part of the playeth did thee write it?
All of Act 1.
Can thee giveth us some specific examples of what is thy worketh?
Sure. Act 1, Scene 2 begins with the characters Charles, the Dauphin of France, proclaiming Mars. His true moving, co-equal as in the heavens, so in the earth, to this day is not known. This is directly paraphrased from something I was working on. I wroteth, you act as ignorant as the astronomers art in the true moving of Mars, which to this day they never could have sustained to. Another example is the fact yon Shakespeare hath used the word Goliases, at which the character Asenath compares the English to Samson and Goliases in Act 1, Scene 2. In current Bibles, the name Goliath is spelled with a TH. It's only in older editions of the Bible that it's spelled with an S. I oft use older spellings of words, while Mr. Shakespeare does not. Finally, Henry VI, Part 1 is a quite termagant play, especially when one compares it to other works Shakespeare has written. While I am a supporter of violence in plays, such as in Henry VI, because it is an effective way to teach history and it promotes patriotism, it is often pondered vulgar by other dramatists, and Shakespeare does not typically use it as much as it is used in this play.
Wherefore didst thee decideth to bringeth this case the present day?
I don't believeth it is right to steal another author's work. It is also negatively affectioned mine own livelihood, because anon I cannot useth any of the worketh yon Mr. Shakespeare did steal.
Didst thee giveth Mr. Shakespeare any permission to useth any of thy worketh?
Nay.
Thank thee, Thomas. Nay further questions.
Thee claim yon Mr. Shakespeare somehow did steal thy worketh? How would thy Shakespeare had access to thy table?
He has been to my home on a number of occasions and could have gotten them in.
Is it possible yon Mr. Shakespeare simply did admire thy worketh and did allow to subconsciously influence his own writing without intentionally copying it?
I don't think so. King Henry VI, Part 1, is so different from his other works. Yond I doth not believe the similarities between our work and writing style was accidental.
Nay, further questions.
Any redirect, Miss Jones?
Just a few questions. Thomas, Mr. Shakespeare has been in thy home.
Aye.
Was Mr. Shakespeare at each moment with thee while in thy home?
Nay. He would cometh over at which hour I would have parties, and oft I would not see him for hours at a time.
And was thy journal hath kept in a locked drawer or safe?
Nay. I just hath left it on my own desk. Anyone in mine own home would have access to it.
Thank thee, Thomas. Nay further questions.
Thee may step down, Mr. Nash. Doth thee have any other witnesses, Miss Jones?
Nay, thy honor, the plaintiff rests.
Miss Smith, thee may calleth thy first witness.
We calleth the defendant William Shakespeare to the standeth.
Doth thee solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help thee God?
I doth.
thee prithee state thy name for thy record?
William Shakespeare, but everyone calleth me Will.
And whither thee wast born, Will?
Stratford upon Avon.
What doth thee doth for a living?
I am a poet and a playwright.
Would we knoweth aught yon thee has right?
I has writ a lot of plays, including the comedies A Winter's Tale, Measure for Measure, and Merchant of Venice, and also some tragedies hath called Julius Caesar, Othello, and Romeo and Juliet. I has also writ historical plays like Henry V.
And thee bid us about thy educational background?
I was educated at King Edward VI Grammar School, also known as the King's New School, a free school very close to mine own home. Whilst there, I studied Greek mythology, Roman comedy, ancient history, and grammar. I did not attend university because mine own family could not afford it.
So how didst thee receiveth into writing?
Mine own first play was Henry VI, Part 1. Also around that time, I had left Stratford to move to London to focus on mine own career as a playwright. I wrote it because I did enjoy pleasing others with mine own writing. I also had found it a most joyous way to comment on contemporary social events. For example, Julius Caesar was writ to show with yon it was well and now to stand up to tyranny. Also, writing is an enjoyable way to make a living and to put food on the table for mine own jauntress and children.
And can thee bid us what did inspire thy writing?
Well, I am did inspire by the same things other writers art did inspire by. History and the worketh of other authors yond we admire. For example, I'm a huge fan of the historians Plutarch and Raphael Hollandish. After reading their works, I would then reshape the plot and use with mine own imagination to make it dramatic plots and dialogue.
Wherefore doth thee bethink yon Mr. Nashe believes yon thee did copy his worketh?
Well, I was not born into a gentle family, nor didst mine own family has a lot of wage. I also didst not marry into wage because mine own family was not wealthy. I didn't not take a university education. I believe this to be is the main reason wherefore I've been labeled a fraud and accused of copyright infringement.
Can thee giveth us a specific example of wherefore thee feeleth this way?
Well, a popular author named Robert Greene wrote a critique about me to some other authors and playwrights in London. In the critique, he hath called me an upstart crow and hath said I didn't belong with the university-educated dramatist crowd.
Didst thee knoweth of any copyright yond wast attached to the worketh yond thou art accused of a copywriting?
Nay.
Didst thee ever directly copy from the worketh of another author at which hour writing thy plays or poems?
Nay.
Thank thee, Will. Nothing further, thy honor.
Mr. Shakespeare, doth thee contend yon thee wroteth Henry VI Part 1 on thy own?
I.
Then can thee pray pardon me, wherefore it is so different than thy other worketh?
I was experimenting with my own writing style at the time, and yond I wrote Henry VI Part 1 thee. I wrote it, and I wrote it yond play quite early in mine own writing career, and hadst not yet perfected mine own writing style.
May I approach the witness, thy honor?
Aye.
Hast thee ever seen Exhibit 1, Mr. Nashe's journal?
Nay.
Hast thee ever did discuss writing style and what thee wast working on with Mr. Nashe?
We would oft break with our worketh, but never in most wondrous detail.
Hast thee ever readeth any of Mr. Nashe's worketh?
I, of course. I am at each moment reading the worketh of mine own fellow playwrights.
Nay further questions.
Any redirect?
Aye, thy honor. William, how often doth thee readeth other authors' worketh?
Quite frequently.
And just because thee readeth other people's worketh, does yon colonly thee copy those folk?
Of course not. I hadst never did copy from another author in mine own life.
Thank thee. Nay further questions. The defense rest.
Thee may step down, Mr. Shakespeare. Art both sides effed for closing arguments?
F thy honor.
F thy honor.
Members of the jury, we are going to hear the closing arguments of the lawyers. The closing arguments are the lawyer's opportunity to argue to thee, wherefore thee shouldest returneth a verdict in their favor. The plaintiff shall argue first, then the defendant, followed by a rebuttal from the plaintiff. Prithee, proceed.
Good morn, ladies and gentlemen. I wanteth to begin it by thanking thee for thy time, thy service, and thy patience. Those of us who as it spendeth or liveth in the justice system truly appreciate the contribution thee maketh. I desire, after listening to this trial, thee hast cometh to realize yond this lawsuit hast importance beyond the two playwrights yond thee see in front of thee, because this lawsuit goeth to the very heart of the writing profession. The reason yond it is so important is because protection for intellectual property paramount to playwrights. The nature of writing is unique to each person. Authors hast his or that lady own style, and voice yond maketh those folk identifiable to the public. The defense hast did present the idea yond people are just jealous of Mr. Shakespeare because of his natural writing talent. Yond other playwrights behold down on him because of his ingraft background and want of education. However, yond is not what the evidence in this case shows. As thee hath heard, Mr. Nashe testified, he wrote the entirety of Act 1 of the play, and many other authors did contribute to other sections. He estimates yond Shakespeare wrote less than 20% of the playeth himself. Yond cometh out to 3,846 out of 20,515 words yond Mr. Shakespeare actually wrote. The other 16,669 words was writ either by Mr. Nashe or by someone else. Alloweth us runneth through the evidence yond shows yond Mr. Nashe actually dith writeth substantial portions of Henry VI, Part 1. First, the direct paraphrasing of the opening lines of Act 1, Scene 2. Second, the use of older spelling of the word Goliath. A writing characteristic yond Mr. Nashe is known for, and something Mr. Shakespeare would beast unlikely to do. Third, the excessive use of violence in the playeth is indicative of Mr. Nashe's writing style. Violence in plays is seen by many dramatists as gratuitous and vulgar, and ere Henry VI, Part 1, Mr. Shakespeare has never hath too much violence in his worketh. All these factors maketh one thing very clear. Mr. Shakespeare substantially tooketh from Mr. Nashe's worketh in charge to writeth Henry VI, Part 1. As I am sure we hast all experienced, writing can eke beast a sore process, especially working as a professional playwright in London. This is not simply a hobby for mine own client, Mr. Nashe. This is his livelihood. As I toldeth thee at the beginning of this trial, we are going to asketh thee to value this case. As thee hast heard Mr. Nashe saith, Mr. Shakespeare's theft has negatively affected his livelihood. All of Mr. Nashe's hard worketh and the potential for those both to maketh profits for him and leadeth to patronages is anon gone. Yond is wherefore we are asking thee to award Mr. Nashe £2 million in damages. We asketh yond thee doth not alloweth Mr. Shakespeare went unpunished for intentionally stealing not only Mr. Nashe's worketh, but eke the worketh of many others, in charge to further his own status and profits.
There is very very much only one issue in this case. Didst the plaintiff satisfy its burden of proof at which hour to accuse Mr. Shakespeare of copyright infringement? The answer is nay. The plaintiff hath given nay solid proof to demonstrate yon Mr. Shakespeare is guilty aught except being a brilliant playwright. Is gross and since hither yon the plaintiff is bringing this case because his aristocratic high society members cannot fathom how someone who isn't waste not born a part of their social class can possibly be the most popular playwright in all of England. He might not beast a fraud because he is not formally did educate and has not traveled the ordinary. However, just because Mr. Shakespeare does not hast an aristocrat upbringing, does not colonly he was born without an imagination. Nay, one is declaring yon history and the worketh of other authors does not influence Mr. Shakespeare. Just as any writer is influenced by both his contemporaries and past writers, Shakespeare did inspire by the worketh of other writers yon he did admire. He has did admit as much. However, Mr. Shakespeare never directly did copy from any other worketh. As thee hath heard, Mr. Shakespeare saith he relies on his own imagination to make it the plays. His imagination is what sets him apart from other playwrights, not the allegation yon he stills worketh from others. The plaintiff want thee to believeth yon Mr. Shakespeare is a fraud, and yon is directly did copy from others to make it the work yon he is famous for. However, the plaintiff hath given any solid proof yon this is the case. It is important to recall yon the plaintiff holds the burden of proof. Mr. Shakespeare does not have to prove aught. It is clear from the evidence yon has been did present, yon the plaintiff hath met its burden. This is wherefore I am calling on thee to findeth Mr. Shakespeare not guilty.
Ms. Jones?
I only asketh yon thee ponder the evidence in this case, at which hour thee compare Mr. Nashe's personal table to the defendant's version of King Henry VI, Part 1. It is gross in sense yon Mr. Shakespeare blatantly tooketh ideas and co-equal specific lines from Mr. Nashe. I am asking thee to hold him accountable and not profit from his wrongdoing.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury,